Well, hello and welcome to the third episode of Up Late with Ben Northey. I'm broadcasting to you once again from managed isolation here in my Wellington hotel room, where I'm on day 9 of my 14-day quarantine before I travel onwards to Christchurch and conduct some concerts there with the CSO, which I'm really looking forward to. I leave the hotel on Saturday, which, as many of you know, happens to be grand final day. And some of you may be aware that I'm what might be described as an oversharer of enthusiasm on social media about my beloved team, the Richmond Tigers. So I'll be cheering loudly that night here in New Zealand. And if you can see behind me, the wonderful decor here in the hotel has a distinctly Richmond theme, which I'm taking as a good omen. But it's been a huge weekend here in New Zealand. There was a federal election on Saturday night, which Jacinda Ardern's Labor Party won in a landslide. And yesterday was the second game of the Bledisloe Cup rugby between Australia and New Zealand. I don't really know that much about rugby, sadly, but I did tune in on the TV. I believe we were the team in the yellow. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm also very sure that we lost badly to the All Blacks. And so while some things have really changed in 2020, some things have remained the same. I don't think we've beaten them for 20 years. But this week is also a very exciting time for the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, because as at midnight tonight, we launched the first 6 months of our 2021 season. And there's been a lot of activity today around that. It's been an absolutely amazing experience to be a part of that season of wonderful music and musicians. I know we're all looking forward to getting the band back together. Everyone involved with the MSO is playing some live music for you again in the new year. So please have a look at that as it goes online. It's been a real collective effort from everybody involved with the MSO to put this together. Our artistic team, led by the Director of Artistic Planning, Matt Hoy, and our artistic committee, the Players Committee, everyone's worked tirelessly to bring this 6 months of concerts together. And we've done it in a way that I think really reflects the creativity and diversity of our city and our state, as we all find new ways to do things and just to exist in a changed world. But, you know, the highlight of my weekend has been to see the restrictions beginning to be eased in Melbourne. It's been a tough road, I know, and it looks like there's finally a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. And how good's it been to see everybody getting their hair cut again? I certainly left at the wrong time, as I won't be able to get a haircut for another week at least, and I'll definitely be on the way to a mullet by then, no doubt. But look, Melbourne's circumstances are unique compared with the rest of Australia. And with regards to the MSO season, you know, safety has informed all of our decisions around the structure of concerts, and we've had to work within guidelines to ensure the safety of our patrons and musicians and staff. But this has also created some great opportunities for innovation. And the program that, you know, we're releasing the first 6 months of 2021. And I think it really speaks to who we are as an Australian arts organisation, our values of celebrating great music in its many forms, of inclusion, of gender equality, and reflecting the diversity of our community, and our ongoing commitment to Australia's reconciliation journey with our First Nations people, and also celebrating the gifts of our world-class Australian musicians, particularly those within the orchestra. So keep an eye out this week for the MSO 6-month season announcement, which I really believe represents a significant landmark in the evolution of our Australian orchestral and musical culture, and it's very exciting. And you can also tune in to the MSO YouTube channel this Thursday for a one-off special event titled Instruments of Change, the Arts and the Environment, where a few of my colleagues are discussing how arts organisations and artists are responding to climate change and what we all could be doing better. So this series of interviews, we've had 2 so far. They're designed to be a window into the careers, the lives and the personalities of the musicians of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. It's a chance for us to relax, have some fun, learn some more about the individuals who go to make up this great orchestra and about their journeys in music. We also get the chance to hear some music specially selected by our guests, and music which they particularly love or highlights their instrument in the orchestra. And just a reminder, please send in your questions via the chat window on YouTube or Facebook, as we would love to hear from you, and I will get to as many of those as I can later in the interview. So look, so far, for those of you who've been watching the earlier episodes, we've met a horn player, we've met a bass player, and tonight we are moving to the top of the woodwind section, and we meet the principal piccolo of the MSO, Andrew Macleod. And Andrew started with the MSO back in 2003. which was also the first year that I conducted the orchestra. And I've since discovered that we have a few more shared musical experiences in the years before he joined the MSO too. I didn't even know about. We'll touch on those tonight. He has a wonderful story to share with us about his passion for music, his musical journey from Rockhampton in Queensland to London, on to Melbourne and almost everywhere else, and also about the importance of role models. Now, that's a great discussion to have, and once again, the crucial role that teachers play in helping us to achieve our fullest potential. He's also just a terrific person, great contributor to the orchestra, a real character. Welcome to you, Andrew Macleod.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, and hello, everyone.
That's great. Great that you're here. And before we get to your musical beginnings in the Sunshine State, I'd like to start by asking, how are you and what have you been doing during the lockdown?
What have I been doing? Well, I started doing a lot of yoga. This is all in order. I enrolled in a university degree, so I'm doing a degree in HR. And I've been doing a fair bit of practice, and I've also been organising a course which is coming up in November for flute players around the country and internationally. It's going to involve a few teachers from Australia and also some guests. We've got Leon Bicey coming and Marianne Gadigian coming. It's called The Complete Flute, so that'll be very exciting. And just in the past couple of days, I sort of felt that my practice room needed a bit of a lift. So I was
going to say, is that a freshly painted green wall? Because in our rehearsal earlier in the week, that wall, I swear, was white behind you and now is green.
Spotted.
What has happened?
Well spotted. Well, look, I just thought, why not? Let's go green. They do say it's not easy being green, but I actually like this colour. And I tell you what, though, small world, I ran out of paint about halfway along this wall here. And I sort of thought, look, can I be bothered going to Kyneton? I live outside of Melbourne, so Kyneton's the closest place I can go to for new paint. And I thought, well, if I don't, we're going to have a bit of a stripe for the interview tonight. So I went to Kyneton, and this really lovely man mixed the paint. And as he was mixing it, I sort of heard this, he was humming to himself, and I thought, that sounds like the Grieg Piano Concerto. And I said, are you humming the Grieg Piano Concerto? And this lovely man said to me, yes, I'm an MSO subscriber, and started to, I mean, you know, you're right, small world. And we had a bit more of a chat, and I introduced myself and said that I play the piccolo, I'm in the flute section. And then he said to me, my daughter plays the flute. So, yeah.
Incredible. What a small world. Well, that's an amazing story. I mean, it does sound like your lockdown's been the opposite of my experience of the lockdown, which was, I mean, you've done so much stuff. You've shamed me. You've shamed most people.
Not at all. It's all been locked in these four walls.
Yeah, well, hallelujah. Well, hopefully that's going to start to change in the next few weeks. But look, let's get to your musical journey, Andrew, because I'm fascinated by the way that you started in music, and particularly the way that you got to the flute, because I mentioned that you were from Rockhampton in Queensland. So where did it all begin for Andrew Macleod with music?
I recall even before I got my first instrument, my father used to play the odd Beethoven symphony on the, stick a record on. And I remember the opening chords to the ninth used to terrify me. I just remember this. So it was sort of there. I think Dad probably would have been musical if he'd had the opportunity, which he didn't, at the time that he grew up. So, I just felt this strong attraction to it. I started like most kids do, playing the recorder at primary school. And for some reason, the flute just attracted me. And there's a bit of a theme with James Galway that's going to run through this interview. So I have memories of seeing James Galway on the television when I was a kid, and just the sound of the instrument and how beautiful it looked as well. And I was also really into technical things. I liked machinery and gadgets. And I think the fact that it had a mechanism sort of intrigued me a little bit. As opposed
there is something very beguiling about the flute, isn't there? I mean, and that was an instrument that became really central in my childhood as well. I started playing it in about grade 6, and I think we both kind of shared that sense of wonder at the beauty of the sound, but also the beauty of the instrument, the way the light danced off the keys, and you're right. And this James Galway influence that you're talking about, that really speaks to the idea of role models. And that's something that I wanted to zoom in on a little bit, because James Galway, for those people who don't know who he was principal flute in the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra under Herbert von Karajan for a long time, but you never see him in the videos. Why is that, Andrew? Why don't you ever see James Galway in the Karajan BPO videos?
He freely talks about this, and I think when he went to Berlin, he'd been living in London prior to that, and he went through a bit of a rebel stage. Had the Frank Zappa beard going and the dark glasses and stuff, and I think it just rankled von Karajan a little bit. So he struck back and sort of tended to edit Jimmy out of the videos.
I see. Well, let's face it, James Galway got his revenge, because he did so much to popularize the flute and wasn't afraid also to reach out to popular culture. And I remember, and you probably do too, seeing that I think there was sheet music in a CD where he was playing things like Flight of the Bumblebee, Pink Panther, kind of popular songs that you could learn and play along with. Was that something that really inspired you to the instrument too?
Yeah, it was. And look, I remember there was a 60-minute story on him too. It must have been, I'd actually started the flute by this stage, but, he was just, I think, at the beginning of his career as a soloist, getting a really big name. And they did a story on him, and he was playing Annie's song as well, the John Denver song, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And I think it became a hit or something, and he really became known for that as well. So I remember trying to play it in the wrong key. It's in D major. I was in C. Yeah.
There was one significant event for you at the Rockhampton Eisteddfod. Now, this sounds like a very serious competition. Now, tell me about your experience at the Rockhampton Eisteddfod, because it's a bit like South Street in Ballarat, I suppose. There's divisions and under 14 woodwind and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How did that work?
Well, look, to start with, musically in Rockhampton, there was so much going on, and I never wanted for an opportunity. I mean, there was a youth orchestra, there was an Eisteddfod, there's all sorts of things going on there. And, the Eisteddfod, like doing an exam as a student, it's a really big thing. And so going and playing on stage and having some adjudicator who's come from the big smoke, probably Brisbane, it was quite daunting. And look, I remember getting up there and probably grade 11 or grade 12. And look, just as a background to this, my wonderful flute teacher in Rockhampton, Della Martin, used to occasionally give me one of her cassette tapes of James Galway. And she gave it to you in a way that just said, this is something really special. This is something that, and it meant a lot to her too. And she really communicated that love of the music to us. And so, of course, I used to listen to these tapes of Galway. And I remember I played this Chaminade concertino in grade 11 or 12, just pretending I was James Galway, probably heaps of vibrato and, just went for it. Yeah. So, it's, again, the role model thing, very important.
Yeah. Do you remember the French flautist Jean-Paul Rampal coming out to Australia? Do you remember that visit? Did you get to ever hear him play?
Jean-Pierre is someone I discovered a little bit later in my life, but no, I wasn't aware of him on the visit. But I remember hearing about him after the fact, that someone was telling me that he got on, it was one of those midday shows or something, Mike Walsh probably then or something, and played one of the Telemann fantasias and just went for it, and it had such musical conviction, a lot of split notes, but musically very vibrant, and he really took risks and very honest music making.
Yeah, he's just such a fearless player. That was the thing I remembered about him, as a great example of just not holding back anything, which is wonderful. I had a note here about your mum's experience of the recorder groups. Is that a story we can talk about? There was something funny about that, I remember. Only
though, if I can preface it by saying I do love the recorder. I have a couple of wooden recorders on the floor, on the shelf here, and at any opportunity I do break them out. So please, I do not wish to offend any recorder players out there. No, I just remember mum saying that whenever, long-suffering parents who have to go to their kids' performances all the time, the 12 and under 14, flute, woodwind solo, whatever it was that I was competing in, it was always after the primary school massed recorder choir, which being plastic recorders and no one really knew how to tune them, must have had a certain sonority, shall we say.
Not for the faint-hearted.
Not for the faint-hearted, no, but nerves of steel in the audience.
Oh, well, and then you hear someone like Genevieve Lacey play it, and it's
Totally.
just
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
extraordinary. Well, look, I wanted to touch on your first teacher, whose name was Della, and what you got from Della. What sort of things did she instill in the young Andrew Macleod about music?
I think just as I said before, just communicating that love of something, that it was very important to her. And I already felt that too, but it's important, I think, in the relationship you have with your teacher, that you can feel that empathy and that common understanding of something that's important. And look, I wasn't always, I must say, the best student. I didn't always practice as much as I should have, but I still loved it. And it was something to aspire to as well. So that sense of, I wanted to go to study music at uni, and I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I wanted to go and do it. And even, yes, I remember seeing the QSO, the Queensland Symphony Orchestra, coming to Rockhampton on one of their regional tours. And that's a really important thing too, so seeing them play the Young Person's Guide at the school's concert was thrilling. I never forgot that. Yeah,
and this
totally.
is the power of the orchestras when they can inspire young people like that, whether it's you in Queensland or Leonard Bernstein in New York, that's amazing. So you started in grade 5 and you worked obviously very hard. It made me remember also you were talking about the Pacific Basin Bands Festival in 1989, which obviously your school group went to. Is that right? How that worked?
Yeah.
Which I was there with my school band as well.
Insane.
I had no idea you were there until you told me that the other day, which is in Hawaii. How did we get to go to Hawaii?
How random. I know.
1989. I mean, that was just... what a coincidence. So we're connected at the hip.
Yes,
Andrew Macleod.
Absolutely. Yep.
And both starting with the MSO at the same time as well. It's
same day,
wonderful.
Actually. Your rehearsal, first rehearsal was my first rehearsal of the Storm Movement from Beethoven 6.
Oh, what a way to start for
I
piccolo.
know. Auspicious.
The piccolo plays the part of the wind of the storm, the howling of the gale. And is that a really hard excerpt to play?
No, not particularly, but it's interesting, like a lot of piccolo excerpts where you have to sit there for 2 movements and not do anything. And then quite often the first entry you make is a solo. That's where it gets a little tricky, where it would be a lot easier mentally, because you feel removed a little bit from it, and then you've got to somehow step back in. And if you're playing a solo and you've already been playing for 30 minutes, you're part of the journey. So it's not the trickiest of the ones where I have to come in. Would be things like Tchaikovsky's 4th Symphony or Beethoven's 9th Symphony, but it's a bit of fun, and it's only 13 notes, so you've got to make them count.
And look, a solo on the piccolo is a real solo, isn't it? I mean, this speaks to the fact that it's the smallest instrument in the orchestra, but by far the one that carries the furthest in terms of sound, and can carry over the entire orchestra playing it at triple forte.
Someone once said to me, it's like playing a piccolo in the orchestra. You have to play in an ensemble. Other times you have to play like the concertmaster in a way, because you're on top of the wave. It's just it's a really incredible experience playing piccolo in an orchestra in full flight.
Well, I remember how amazing you were that day. I was basically just standing on the podium saying, "Oh, that sounds good. Oh, that sounds good. Nice. Oh, goodness me, they're very good, aren't they?" Fledgling conductor. But look, there are questions coming in, which I'll get to. Lots of people asking for advice for young players and memorable audition experiences, which we'll get to a bit later on. So thank you for those, and keep them coming. Send your questions in the chat window on YouTube and Facebook. We would love to hear from you, and we'll get to as many of them as I can. Okay, so you've kind of had your experience of inspiration with the Young Person's Guide. You've decided that music was what you wanted to do, but you had options, didn't you? You were sort of wondering at various times about other things like law or writing or history.
I think you don't know. I really enjoyed writing at high school, but even though you do contemplate other options, there was never a doubt. I always wanted to go and do music.
What about the piccolo, though? Because I'm assuming you're just playing flute at this point, or did you always play the piccolo through high school as well?
I got a piccolo at one point. Look, I remember, and again, it's that feeling of being attracted to an instrument, calling you in a way. And I remember sitting in the concert band at high school, seeing the person in the first flute chair playing the piccolo. And I just remember thinking, that is so cool. This, really tiny flute, And again, the small mechanism and everything intrigued me, but the sound of it, and it had such character and personality that I really felt attracted to it, and not just because it can be loud or project, but just the character of its voice in a way. So I remember nagging mum for a while, and she finally bought me a silver-plated Armstrong piccolo, and I was probably sitting on top of her while she was making the dinner in the kitchen, screeching away, going, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" And she was probably reaching for her glass of wine, which I may do in a minute. So I got my first piccolo. But when I went to university, it is to study flute. So I did my BMAS and studied flute, but as luck would have it, my teacher at university was Jeanette Manricks, who was the principal piccolo in the Queensland Symphony Orchestra. So although we did a lot of flute, I also enrolled in a second study piccolo. So I got to have some piccolo lessons with Jeanette as well. So that sort of started to steer me a little bit. And as I said, I always loved it. So it wasn't difficult to steer me to play piccolo.
Yeah, well, there's a question that's come in about how you transitioned to the piccolo. And I was going to ask, when it became clear that it was the specialization, because that is a very specific skill to be able to play orchestral piccolo. There are lots of questions also about what's the most challenging solo in the orchestra, which we'll also get to later on. But when did that specialization emerge, and what was your next step after the Queensland uni experience?
Okay, I went and studied after I finished my BMAS, and I hung around for a couple of years and enrolled in a master's, and was still doing flute. And whenever I was called on to play piccolo in a show or casual work in the orchestra or something, I would play it and enjoy it. And then I went to London, and I went to study with Trevor Y, who actually was a sort of contemporary of Jimmy Galway, actually, and also another celebrated English player, William Bennett. They all sort of knew each other.
Were they orchestral players, or were they soloists, or what did they?
Wib played in the English Chamber Orchestra for many years, and Trevor played on the London scene. Wib, when I say Wib, I mean William Bennett. He taught at the Royal Academy of Music, and my teacher Trevor used to teach at the Royal Northern College, and then he left that post and then began to run his own private studio, which is where I went, which was 8 months or 9 months at the time of the flute, and nothing but the flute.
How many students did he have at one time?
Usually 6 or 7.
Wow.
So it was a really small class, and in my year we had a student from South Africa, 2 Japanese students, and actually we had 7, so 3 Americans and then myself. So, and probably one that used to pop in every now and again from Portugal. So it was a small group, and we were all billeted out in this.
That must have been amazing. Like, what was that like coming from Queensland to rural England? I mean, what a move. That must have been quite difficult, I imagine.
Yeah, it was it was a shock, and but a good shock. And I guess you don't know what to expect when you're going there, because everything's different, and you have to acclimatize yourself to just living in the middle of nowhere in the UK. It was a little village. The closest town was Ashford, which is remarkable for the fact that it has a Eurostar stop. But this beautiful tableland, little idyllic little village, and we used to walk from each of our houses to Trevor's studio through the muddy paddocks, and spend all Monday, all Wednesday doing studies, repertoire. We'd have guest teachers come down. So we had Patricia Morris, who was a piccolo player in the BBC Symphony. She used to come down and take a class. And we had Rachel Brown, who's the traverso player. One of Trevor's former students. She plays in the Academy of Ancient Music, I believe, and a couple of other players from the opera. So people used to come through and give classes, and it was pretty intense. When you weren't doing classes, you were preparing for next week's repertoire. So
yeah, it sounds like a great training. And but tell me about Trevor. What kind of a teacher was he? Was he kind of fatherly, or was he tough as nails? What was the approach from Trevor?
He could be many things. He could be really tough and really pushed people, but he said to people, "I'm not here to be everyone's best friend. I'm here to help you become great flute players, or as great a flute player as you can be." Yeah. So, you weren't there to be his friend, but he could be incredibly generous and very kind, and also, yeah, as you said, tough as nails. So yeah.
What did he work on mainly? I mean, was it sort of technique? Was it sound? What was his main message as a teacher, do you think?
Sound, definitely.
Yeah.
But technique, we used to start each class with a group all standing around in a circle, group scale warm up, everyone playing in unison these Reichert scales, and which could be quite full on if you were coming in as the new person and there was someone doing their second year of the course who was all over the instrument, you know. But so technique was essential, but always at the service of music. So he used to, I remember spending an hour out the front of a class once, and the classes were in a European style. So all the other students were there whilst you were having your lesson. And he spent an hour with me on getting a particular colour in the opening of one of the Moy's little melodic studies, just to get the sound right. And it was done with such care. And, you know, I actually recorded the lesson. I keep meaning to listen to it, you know, all these years later, but that was when he was at his finest.
Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful experience. And I know that you credit him with getting the MSO job, which is no mean feat. You know, there are questions coming in about who would you love to write a piccolo concerto for you. It's amazing that we have performed a piccolo concerto with the MSO, the two of us, which we will talk about as well, but that might be a question we want to keep up your sleeve for later as well. So look, I know there's a bit of a journey before we get to the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, but you came back after this study in the UK, and that's a transition that most people who've studied overseas can relate to, this getting back, trying to find your place in the place that you left. I presume you went back to Queensland. Is that where you ended up first?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
And so what did you do there?
Well, I got back, and look, it's the same for everyone. And I'm very mindful now when students come back of, you know, reaching out to them when I can, but very quickly things move on. And that's the way things are, of course. You know, there's someone new on the gig scene, there's someone moved in very quickly. And look, I was thinking at the time, oh dear, you know, I'm back from studying, I'd better get a job, you know, and I wanted to start doing auditions. So, you know, talk about, you know, right time, right place. And the lovely woman, Ailsa Knott at Queensland Uni, called me up one day. She was the administrative officer at the School of Music where I'd studied. And she said, oh, Andrew, it's Ailsa here. I won't do Ailsa's voice, lovely lady. And she said, oh, could you come and help us out? We need a new concert officer. So I was like, absolutely. And I got an office job part-time, but I was working in music. I got to program some concerts. I got to occasionally book an entire orchestra for things, so contracting orchestras. I did the publicity, so I wrote press releases and things. And the brilliant thing was, aside from that, I was still working in music. I won't say there was any nepotism. I didn't give jobs to my friends, but I could go and practice. I was in a school of music, and I had access to practice rooms. So I was still very much involved in the music industry, which I think is a very important thing. You know, you still need to feel that connection. Yeah. But it's interesting that musicians being musicians can sometimes we are very focused on what we do. And I remember getting a phone call a couple of days after I'd set myself up in my cushy office. It was Jeanette, my teacher, Jeanette Manricks, saying, I hear you've given up the flute. And I said to her, no. And I explained the situation. And end of the story, she now tells students, oh, get an office job. It's great. You can go and practice. So, but yeah, it's interesting how word got around quickly that you're either in playing the flute or doing gigs or teaching, or you weren't. And I sort of thought, no, there are other things. And I've said to a lot of students since then, don't keep your blinkers on. So I've had students now who've gone off to, one of them got a job in the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, an ex-student. Another one works at ABC Classic programming music. I've got other students who work in the school system in Victoria, and I'm very proud of all of them, but I've said to them, don't have blinkers on, because you never know where the flute could possibly take you.
Oh, well, look, that's an amazing story. And I should let you have a swig of that wine there, Andrew, as well.
Thank you.
You know, we're supported with Up Late with Ben Northey by Tarrawarra Estate. You've been sharing so many of these wonderful stories and information about your journey. I'm talking with Andrew Macleod, the principal piccolo of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, as we find out more about his pathway in music. And this is a pivotal moment, because after all of that practice and that experience of having that possibility to practice so hard. You started auditioning, didn't you?
I did.
You know, all for specifically piccolo jobs, which I imagine. I mean, what are the excerpts on the piccolo repertoire? What do you have to prepare?
There's quite a few, and it also, you know, it's interesting when you see different excerpts chosen by different panels now, and you think, is that going to show everything? Or it's an art form in itself, picking the excerpts which will show the player off and enable players to stand out, so you hear their voices. So look, we anything from a lot of Shostakovich. You'll hear some beautiful soft solos, like from the Sixth Symphony of Shostakovich. You might hear Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which is the moment that the piccolo, contrabassoon and bass trombone made their debut together in the symphonic repertoire. You may have a Ravel piano concerto, Daphnis and Chloe, Prokofiev, Love for Three Oranges. There's Tchaikovsky symphonies. So there's actually a lot of repertoire. And of course,
and I'm imagining melodic things, right? So I mean, we think of that solo in the Scherzo of Tchaikovsky 4, which you mentioned. It's hard because you sit there for ages, and all of a sudden, you know, a lot of it depends on the tempo and all that kind of thing. But actually, what can you find out about somebody through that solo in an audition?
Not a lot. To me, not a lot at all, but something. I mean, you have to be able to play it, obviously.
Yes. Yeah.
But then, to hear Shostakovich Leningrad, or to hear, and even Vivaldi Piccolo Concerto, which is a standard. It's not originally written for the instrument, but they often hear the second movement, or you can hear in an audition. I have played the second movement of one of the Mozart flute concertos, was asked on piccolo, in addition to flute excerpts as well. The second movement,
because you have to play flute as well as piccolo. That's the other thing people need to realize. You're the principal piccolo, but you're also playing flute, and sometimes principal flute as well. I mean, I love your principal flute playing.
Oh, thank you, Ben.
I've got great memories of having you over to Christchurch playing principal flute with us over in that orchestra as well. But you know, my memory of the exposed piccolo moments, because as I said, there's nothing like a piccolo solo to really define what a solo is. Are things like the death of Liu moment in Turandot by Puccini in the opera, the ending of Mahler's 10th Symphony Adagio, where you're just kind of sitting as the icing on top of the soft chords at the ends of pieces, and they're so exposed, and you know, you're amazing at that stuff with your intonation. But is there a kind of a mental adjustment required to be made on playing those really exposed, walking on eggshells kinds of lines? How does that work?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that. It's slightly counterintuitive. It's not about squeezing and tightening or anything for those soft high notes. Good use of the air. But I think you said earlier being fearless or something. I think you did. And in a way, you've got to be fearless, but the way you actually achieve that, I feel, is really feeling part of the orchestra, so that I'm not just, even though sometimes you are quite, very exposed, you have others playing with you. So I sort of rely on that a lot. You know, at the end of the Mahler 10 excerpt you just mentioned, I'm with the first violins. So I try and adjust the color so that it blends with them. So it is definitely mental preparation. I won't say I don't get nervous sometimes. Everybody does. You know, anyone that said they didn't is probably lying. But I think that's not such a bad thing either. You know, sometimes the nerves bring that, you know, that special something to the performance.
That's right, and that level of focus. Well, look, we should listen to some of the music that you have chosen. Tell us about the first excerpt we're going to hear.
I believe this is Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. Is that right? Yes. So
that's right, which we heard a little bit of on the play-in to this. But what's so special about this excerpt?
I don't have to play for the first 6 bars when this actually begins. It's the second suite of Daphnis and Chloe, so it's a part of a much bigger ballet, but it's been cut into a suite. So I don't play for the first 6 bars, and this sound world that just comes out. I mean, I have 6 bars to just think, wow, it's just magic. You know,
it's a sunrise, right?
Yes.
And what role are you playing in this sunrise?
Well, 3 guesses, everyone out there. It's a bird.
It's a bird. It's a plane.
I play a bird. And the first flute and I have a few interjections together. It's really, really beautiful. And then there's about halfway down the first page, it's a very short piccolo solo, and it's written in the part, it's almost meant to be off stage, but it just happens and it's gone like the wind. And it's one of those moments that it's short, but I love it.
Well, let's have a listen now to the opening of the second suite of Daphnis and Chloe by Maurice Ravel. That has to be just some of the greatest music you could ever experience, isn't it?
It blows my mind. Like every time we play that, I just think, how Ravel, I mean, we all know he's a genius, but I don't take him for granted. I just sit there every time thinking, wow, how could a human being have this fantasy of color, and
that was an MSO performance, right? Too, I should point out.
It was.
Right? So, do you remember when that was?
Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. And interestingly, this is for piccolo nerds out there. I was thinking, I sound a bit different to what that I had before. And I'm actually using Jeanette Manrick's old piccolo that I actually bought. My old teacher's piccolo I now own, and it's got a very dark color to it. It's made from cocos wood. And I was just listening to that thinking, now I know why it sounds different. Yeah, so there's a nice connection with my old teacher there.
Well, I mentioned that there was a question about concertos, and if you could ask anybody to write a piccolo concerto, which there are not that many of. I'm sure there's more than I know about. You must know of a few, but you're one of the few players who's actually played a piece that was specifically written for you, wasn't it? The piccolo, by Paul Stanhope. We talked to this Australian composer Paul Stanhope, which we performed a number of years ago with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Tell me about that process of collaborating with Paul. Was that something backwards and forwards and showing the possibilities of the instrument and that kind of thing?
It was. And look, it all came about. I was teaching flute at the Australian Youth Orchestra camp in 2011, I believe. And Paul and I had a conversation one night, and we, there may have been a wine or two involved. And he said to me, "Oh, Andrew, so are there any good piccolo concertos out?" And I said, we've got the Vivaldi, which is not really written for us. And there are a couple. There's one by Lieberman, an American composer. It's a very beautiful piece. But I said, I'd love, it'd be great to get a new piece written. And Paul sort of more or less said, I'd write one. And I sent to him the next day, did you really mean that, or was it the wine? And he said, no, I meant it. So I spoke to Hugh Humphreys, who was then the Director of Artistic Planning at the MSO. And a couple of days later, it seemed like that anyway, Hugh walked past me in the corridor and said, "Oh, it's done, it's commissioned." And it was like, oh, wow. And so it was a co-commission between the MSO, the Adelaide Symphony, and the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra. Yep. So one of the really nice things was I got to include my two other colleagues, so Julia Grenfell, a good friend of mine who's the principal piccolo in Adelaide, and Lloyd Hudson, who is the piccolo player in TSO. And so I worked with Paul in terms of him sending parts to me. And I must say, he just picked up the instrument like that. There was only a couple of times I asked, for mercy in some of the technical bits, but he knew how to write for the instrument.
Yeah, and he's so clever. He's so clever, Paul. And the thing that I took away from that, because I was so lucky to get to conduct that concert, and I remember him using the low register so effectively of the piccolo. You think everybody's going to use the high register and be virtuosic. The mysterious colors of the low register and the long breathed lines that he used so effectively.
Yeah, I love I'm borrowing from Patricia Morris, the piccolo player from BBC, who once described, said the piccolo can be the soulful little flute. And I think that's something that Paul really touched on in the concerto, the absolute low register colors and things, as well as the stratospheric, exciting writing. But and there was
I'm not sure that we're going to be. Yeah, that's right. The big cadenza. I remember that part. Well, we should have a listen to a little bit of this. What are we hearing? Which movement is this?
It's a little excerpt from the first movement. So it's sort of one of the faster bits, but yeah.
Okay.
About 50 seconds.
Well, let's have a listen to it now. It brings back such great memories hearing that.
Yeah,
and, you know,
that's
a commercially released CD
it
was released on the MSO Live label. That'll be available on Apple Music and all of those
and Spotify.
platforms.
And I must say, the CD was not, I think it was in 2014, was nominated for an ARIA in the Best Classical CD category. And so yours truly, never expecting to go to an awards ceremony for a piccolo concerto. I was up there, and it was the year that Sia was nominated for something else, and this, that, and the other. And they read out, you know, the big voice saying Andrew Macleod, Stanhope piccolo concerto, and it flashed up on the screen. It was one of those weird, wow. Piccolo
and that's
concerto.
How we started.
Yes.
That's how we started driving Lamborghinis. It's amazing the way that it works.
Ben.
The royalties of classical music are just so profound.
It's flowing.
Look, I digress. I want to just talk a little bit about that time and address something that I think is very relevant and important for musicians to discuss, and that was the playing injury. So some kind of injury that you had to deal with after that concerto, wasn't it? Or was it before? I can't remember.
It was after, but look, I felt something was a bit odd for a while, and I'm not someone to actually ignore things. You know, I go and get things checked out, and I just felt that it wasn't as easy as it used to be. And I actually was doing a bit of, I'd taken some time off MSO, and I had the opportunity to go and play with the Oslo Philharmonic in Norway. And I was there for a few weeks, and it's around that time that I really started to find it difficult to technically play things in my left hand. And I had a pretty good idea what it was because I'd had a colleague in the MSO who'd actually experienced the same thing. And I did actually have the beginnings of focal dystonia, which is best described as a neurological thing caused by overuse. An example of, this isn't dystonia, but so people can understand, one of my Alexander teachers once said that long after someone's broken leg has healed, they'll still walk with a limp. So it becomes an entrenched motor pattern. It can come from many reasons. Sometimes it's from overuse. And for me, I think I changed my hand position very slightly in the, you know, aiming to try and improve things, because I've always worked hard. And I think that set off a chain of compensations. And look, I did the Stanhope with you in June of 2013, and probably by the end of that year, when I came back from Norway, slightly earlier than I'd planned, I was really finding it hard to play. And come January of 2014, that would have been 2013, 2014, I could barely play Mary Had Little Lamb. It was just...
And so lots of physio follows that, which must have been very confronting, as anybody not being able to play their instrument finds.
It's incredible.
And I always my heart goes out to players who have these kinds of injuries, because it's a long road back sometimes. And so, you know, lots of physio for you. 6 months later, you return to work, but you don't just go straight back into a full workload, do you?
No.
You ease your way back in.
I got very good advice. Someone said to me, don't just go back in, be very selective in the programs you choose. I also got very good advice in seeing the right specialists, and also learnt to trust my gut feeling. And if someone wasn't giving me the right advice, I would move on. But also to seek out the right advice. And actually, I talked to people all over the world. I was FaceTiming a jazz flute player in New York who'd had it and recovered, because there's a lot of loud voices on Google, and quite often it's people with all the despair stories, and it's very easy to listen to that. So I learned very quickly to trust in the process and the hundreds of hours of physiotherapy I had to do. And to expect a positive outcome. You know, your mental attitude to things is everything. And look, I've made, in a couple of years, probably 3 or 4 years after that, total recovery to the point where I don't think about it now. But I don't regret
but
that
it's a
happened.
long rehabilitation. It's a very long rehab, isn't it? I mean, that's the thing for people to realize. Well, look, that's a very inspiring story to talk about. And I think that's something that is really interesting to people, regardless of where they're at in their careers, and just the nature of the repetitive work, the practice of over years to get the job in the first place, and then the relentlessness of an orchestral job. What advice, there's a couple of questions here. Let's get to those. What advice do you have for a young piccolo player? Is there any kind of pearl of wisdom that you can, I mean, this whole thing's been an education in itself, really, for young players hearing about a career as a piccolo player, but is there any specific bit of advice you'd like to share?
I was just going to say, look, play the piccolo, enjoy the piccolo. But when going onto the piccolo, there's always less of an adjustment than you think is needed between flute and piccolo. So there's no need to get tight or small. Still be generous with your air, don't tighten up or anything, and you will find the sound. There's no need to tighten your lips or anything like that.
That's the thing I've noticed about you. You always look relaxed. Your embouchure seems relaxed. You're never forcing the air through the instrument. It's amazing. And that's a great piece of advice, because yes, by its nature, it sort of encourages you to tighten up and really, be focusing the embouchure and that kind of things.
But even for
what about?
Go.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, there's another question here. What is the most challenging piccolo solo in the orchestral repertoire? I'm sure there's a number of. What's the one that when you see it on the roster, you go, okay, then here we go.
Oh, yeah. Look, I hate to drag out a big answer to that one, but they're challenging for different reasons. So, Chike 4, whenever I see it coming up, I think, oh yes, the great sit on the chair for half an hour before you come in. Oh, that's the mental focus week. But then there's some interesting, some of the Shostakovich symphonies, fantastic, but they're all challenging in a different way. I hate to not give an answer there, but challenging is also exciting. Scheherazad's got some great moments, and
does. That's got some wonderful piccolo moments in it as well. There's another question about auditions. Have you got any memorable audition experiences or any tips about the auditioning process?
When it comes to an audition, do the preparation, do the practice, know the music. So to have an idea of how the excerpts sound in the orchestra, it always comes across. And look, apart from the usual things of really have good rhythm, a good sound, good intonation, to also play with your own voice. And because people on the panel, they want to hear what you have to say as a musician. I've always found it odd when people say, oh, I'm going for a job. How does the, the first flute, or how does the section want this to sound? And I sort of think, well, you don't want to play in a way that is not you. You have to be true to yourself. So, and I think that's really important in communicating. That's what's going to be what touches the panel.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking the pressure off yourself by focusing on the journey and enjoying the journey, getting your satisfaction from the journey, not the goal, not thinking about the goal.
Absolutely. It's always about the journey. And they do say, don't they, that a couple of days before you throw the book away. And it's just, you just, the preparation's done, and it's just about the journey.
Free yourself up. That's very, very true, isn't it? And just concentrate on making music, which is always done best in a relaxed, free state, so that we can be really at one with the music. Well, look, Andrew, this has been just a fascinating interview. I've loved talking to you. You're one of my favorite members of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra.
Oh, thanks.
And I think it's been just very, very instructive for anybody out there, flautists especially, and especially those people who want to specialize in one of the more sort of niche instruments of the orchestra, because it is a very special member of the orchestra, and when it's played with the sensitivity that you play it with, it's just magic to hear. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Andrew.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching Up Late with Ben Northey. It's just been great to hear Andrew Macleod's story and to hear him share his journey. Thanks also for sending through your great questions. There are a few more that I didn't get to tonight. And to Tarawara Estate for the Vino. there's I don't think you're meant to bring the wine into the hotel managed isolation here, but you should have seen the looks on the faces of the army guys running the hotel quarantine when I said it was for work purposes. I'm not sure they believed me really, but anyway, I've got the wine in the room. So by the time I see you again, Monday night next week, I will be in Christchurch, where I'll have the chance to interview one of the great personalities of the MSO, who this year celebrated 40 years with the orchestra. And it's our first violinist, Eleanor Mancini, member of the first violin section. One of my all-time favorite musicians and humans. And Eleanor's interview is just not to be missed, as she shares her extraordinary journey from behind the Iron Curtain in Russia to her 4-decade career with the MSO. It's a conversation not to be missed. Absolutely extraordinary. I hope you can join us next Monday night. So thanks again, Andrew. You enjoy the rest of your wine. Thanks, there.
Thank you.
Yes, I will be too. And in the meantime, for those of you watching in Melbourne, enjoy some well-earned freedoms announced on the weekend. Get those haircuts. Keep taking care of each other. Stay safe. Thanks for watching. Cheers and go well.